But thank y'all for having me on. Looking forward to talking with you. Just show of hands, how many have ponds on their property? It's a pretty substantial amount. How many want ponds? All right, maybe after listening to this, you may still want a pond. Now there's a clicker. So when it comes to pond management, when you look at the state of Alabama, there's an abundance of water. So not just the rivers and streams that we add them all up is about 127,000 miles that will stretch around the earth about 5 times. But when you look at just the amount of ponds in Alabama, there's over about 250,000. So it's a substantial amount of water, and they vary in size, just from your quarter acre smaller ponds that may be in somebody's backyard or a water garden. It expands to some of the larger reservoirs that we have, like Lake Eufaula, Lake Martin, depending on what part of the state you're from. But looking at it from a pond management perspective, everybody has their own goal or their management strategy that they want for that pond. Some may just want to manage it for good recreational fishing. Some may want to have just the aesthetics of it. I've ran into folks that want to have an alligator in their pond. So everybody manages their pond different. So through this talk, I want to be able just to give y'all some ideas, maybe spur some thoughts, as well as kind of point out some of the things that I see working with landowners on a day-to-day basis. So looking at the basic principles of ponds. I'm a walker when I talk, so I'm trying to stay behind this podium, so y'all bear with me. But the basic principles of pond management, and we're going to incorporate this even if you have a pond. Build it right, eliminate the wild fish, stock it by the numbers, maintain fertility in their pond. Big one, keep out the weeds, and then harvest. And that's one of the biggest things that landowners fall short, is not pulling out fish out of your pond. Look at your pond like a garden. You're going to line your garden, you're going to fertilize your garden, and at the end of the year, you're going to harvest. So looking at your pond the same way, you're going to have to harvest at the end to make sure that that pond is really maximizing the benefit to you. So building your pond or maintaining your pond, you want to build it right. Ideally, you want the banks of that pond under the water to go from a 2-to-1 to a 3-to-1 slope. So you want the banks to drop off fairly quickly. And that's going to play into, when we talk about fertilization of the pond, but one of the biggest things that's going to play into weed control and managing for weeds. And one of the other things is you want to make sure that you keep up those banks. So a lot of times people will have ponds that use it for a multi-use recreational pond, as well as maybe livestock watering. And that's one thing to really keep in mind, is that those livestock may be filling in those banks, sedimenting those banks, as well as causing some serious rutting or erosion on those banks as well too. Like you see in the picture on the right, the ruts that are going into that pond. And so not only is it going to open yourself up for some potential issues with erosion and maybe weed problems in that pond, but it's also going to limit the accessibility that you have if you want to go fishing or recreational use of that pond. So it's real important to keep grass on the banks as well as the dam. Other thing is keep the dam free of any type of trees. As those trees grow, what's going to happen to the root system? It's going to go further and further down. So yeah, there's some risk of it maybe penetrating the core of the dam. But as that tree gets larger, if there's ever a chance that it dies or gets blown over in the storm, that root ball is going to take a large portion of your dam with it and compromise the integrity of it. So typically, you want to keep all trees off of the dam. Now, if you have a pond that has trees growing on it, you may want to look at removing any kind of tree that has a diameter, or we consider it a diameter or crest height, which is 4.5 feet. You want to look to remove those if they're less than about 6 or 7 inches. Anything larger than that, at this point, it's probably worth just keeping it on there. Also, a lot of the hardwood species, as y'all are aware, that's going to grow in the dam, you might have to come back with some type of cut stump treatment just to prevent that root or that tree from reestablishing from that root collar. And then one of the other key things that I see or that's missing in ponds, maybe that have been there for a while, is a trash rack. And I put this picture on the bottom right as just a good representation. You can spend as little money or as much money as you want on that, but the one on the bottom right is as simple as a piece of corrugated pipe that just sits on top of your standpipe. So not only is that going to prevent trash, weeds, limbs from getting in your standpipe and potentially clogging it up, but it's also going to encourage subsurface drainage. So as that trash pack sits over your standpipe, water is going to pool from the bottom and then go down the drain. Because your nutritious, or the high nutrient water is going to be at the top of your water column. So you really want to encourage drainage off that pond from the lower nutrient area. Next thing is maintaining good water quality. And depending on where you are in the state, it can vary. If you're down in this area, we have a lot of sandy soils. So the soils are going to share their properties with the water. So down here, we typically have pretty poor water quality. And the factors that we look at in pond management is alkalinity, hardness, and pH, because ultimately they're all going to tie together. So the alkalinity is going to be the measure of the basis in the water, or it's also going to be the buffering capacity of the water. So your pond water is going to shift pH-wise, or between acidic and basic, throughout the day. And that's just a property of the water. The higher alkalinity that you're going to have, it's going to limit that amount of shift in pH. So obviously, the lower the amount of shift in pH, the less stress it's going to potentially cause on your fish. The hardness in the pond is going to be the measure of the concentration of the calcium and magnesium ions. So what that is, that's extra nutrients. So when you fertilize the pond, it's going to be the additional nutrients in that for not just the lower levels of the food chain, but also some of the middle levels, like your clams, your mollusks, some of your shell-producing species, per se. And then again, going back to the pH, and what I'm talking about earlier with the pH shifting throughout the day, mainly it's just a product of the oxygen and the carbon dioxide in the water. So throughout the day, you're going to have phytoplankton, small microscopic organisms. It's a plant that's going to be undergoing photosynthesis and pulling carbon dioxide out of the water and replacing it with oxygen. Well, at night, that plant can't undergo photosynthesis, so it's going to be consuming oxygen, and carbon dioxide is going to be building up. So that carbon dioxide is going to interact with the water and form a carbonic acid that's going to make the water more acidic at night, if that makes sense. So that alkalinity and hardness is important to prevent that wide shift throughout the day. One of the things to do, excuse me, if you have a pond, is get your water tested. Very, very simple process, getting it tested once a year, every couple of years. And that can be simply easy as contacting your local county extension office or submitting a water sample to your local office, to myself. There's a fish farming center in Greensboro, or even into Auburn. Also, the Freshwater Fisheries Department of Conservation have regional offices. They'll be happy to test your water as well, too. One of the things we meant to mention beforehand and didn't get out was that in the future, if you want to get your water tested at this meeting, feel free to bring it here and we'll collect it and we'll get it tested and we'll get responses back to you. Submitting a water sample, though, there's a diagram up here. Just all we need is about a 20-ounce sample. Sealing it up, mailing it off, like I said, or taking it to your county extension office. But going to your pond, empty bottle, rinsing it out a couple times, filling it up with water, and then submitting it in. So if you get to the point where your pond has low alkalinity, low hardness, very, very simple remedy to that is liming your pond. They make a slew of products from quick lime to hydrated lime to pelletized lime. I would recommend not using those in your pond. Just going back to simple ag lime. It's sold by the ton and fairly inexpensive. You're talking 25, 35 pounds for $30 a ton. And getting that spread as evenly as possible over your pond is going to help boost that alkalinity and that hardness in your pond. Typical application rates, like I said, is going to vary between 2 to 4 tons. So not a very, very expensive method where it becomes problematic is getting the lime spread out on the pond. You're looking at possibly having somebody bring in a liming barge to spread it out, or you might be able to have access from the banks to project that. But getting an even amount of coverage over the pond is going to be your best avenue. Liming time is going to be best in fall or your winter months. You want to avoid the growing season because when you apply lime to your pond, it's going to clear it up. So applying in the dormant season, late fall, early winter, typically less rain, so there's less risk of that lime flushing out of your pond. You want to be able to keep it or retain it in that pond as much as possible. And typically you want to re-lime your pond about every 2 years or so, but really based on your water test. So that's why we go back to testing the water every couple of years to get a best idea of when it needs to be limed. So fish composition in your pond. The most common makeup in ponds or Alabama farm ponds are going to be your largemouth bass, bluegill, and potentially red ear sunfish. So when we look at these 3 species, and they're specifically the bluegill and the largemouth bass, the bluegill is going to be the prey fish or the forage fish for that largemouth bass, which is going to be your top predator in your pond. So if you're looking to create a new pond or stock a pond, that largemouth bass, if you're planning on fertilizing it, you're going to put about 75 to 100 fish in your pond. If you're looking at stocking bluegill and red ear sunfish on a new pond, you're looking to put potentially 800 bluegill and 200 red ear sunfish, or just 1,000 bluegill. So ultimately, you want to make sure that there's enough prey fish, those bluegill or those bream species, to sustain that largemouth bass species. Other potential fish that may be in ponds, and want to go over some of the characteristics of why it may be beneficial to your pond, why it may not be something that you want. But channel catfish are fish very, very fun to catch, as well as very, very good eating fish as well too. Very, very popular game fish. The things with putting channel catfish in your pond, specifically if it's a bass or a bluegill pond, the catfish are going to have a tough time reproducing. So typically, putting channel catfish in your pond, you're going to have to constantly restock them as you put them out. Now, it's important as you're putting channel catfish in your pond to make sure that you put them in that 10 or so inch length, just to prevent them from being really expensive fish food for your bass. And giving them an opportunity to recruit or grow to adulthood. Crappie or crappie, depending on what part of the state you're from, is another very, very popular fish. And one of the things with crappie or crappie, I'm going to say crappie, is in smaller ponds they just don't do very well. Now, if you have a smaller pond and you like crappie, then by all means put crappie in your pond. But typically in smaller ponds, there's a chance for them to really start competing with your bass and your bluegill in your pond. And what you result in that situation is stunted fish or each individual species suffering. So typically recommended putting them in larger ponds if it's something that you want to do. Some of the other forage fish to put in your ponds, fathead minnows, threadfin shad are two very, very popular ones. One of the things with fathead minnows really look like, or we refer to them as hot dogs with fins. If you stock them in your ponds, the bass love them. It'll get to the point where they'll eat them up fairly, fairly quickly. So typically, if you stock fathead minnows in your pond, they're more than likely going to be gone by August. So it's something that you will need to consistently restock to provide some additional forage for your bass. But it's something that will have to be done every year. Looking at threadfin shad is another species potentially that can be added to ponds for forage as well too. And then some of the additional ones, golden shiners, gizzard shad, some special consideration should be put some thought into that, or even talking with the fisheries biologist or your county extension office before adding those. Golden shiners are one of those that needs to be at very, very brushy ponds. And there's also potential for golden shiners to compete with your bluegill. So putting golden shiners in your pond, just expect there may be some diminished results or growth on your bluegill population. Gizzard shad, as you can see on the right up there, they can grow very, very large. So gizzard shad should only be put in ponds for when you're really going to manage for trophy bass ponds. And then finally getting into the fun part, the harvest. One of the most important things really in managing your pond, and I harped on earlier, looking at your pond as a garden, and then ultimately harvesting at the end. So your bass are going to control your bluegill populations or your bream species in your pond. But it's up to us to control those bass species or the bass numbers in your pond. So if you're not fishing out bass, they're going to continue to reproduce and they're going to continue to eat. So typically what you see are stunted bass all in that 12 to 15 inch size with very, very thin profile, very torpedo look. So, and this is a typical problem, a bass trout problem in ponds that are just left alone. So ultimately, you want to harvest bass out of your pond. And depending on your management goals, or if you're fertilizing your pond or not, can vary. Ideally, if you're not fertilizing, pulling out about 10 pounds of bass per acre of pond. If you're fertilizing your pond, you can pull up to 25 pounds. So if you think about it, if you have a 4-acre pond and fertilizing it, it's going to produce, or you need to pull out 100 pounds of bass. Now that's not to say if you catch a 10-pound bass every time that you pull out 10 of them, because ideally you want that 10-pound bass back in the pond reproducing, sharing its genetics, so that when you're harvesting your fish, you want to target those ones that are right about a pound in that 12 to 15 inch size group. So ultimately, making that harvest goal can be very, very difficult. So that's where it comes into play, that creating harvest records to get an idea of how much bass that you're pulling out of your pond. And bluegill or bream species as well too, but the most important is that bass. And also those harvest records are important if you have folks coming into your pond. Getting an idea of what they're pulling out can give you some, be able to set some management goals for the composition of the pond. Yes, sir.
And then what, large ponds, small ponds?
All sizes.
So what's the large pond, what's the small pond? What are you getting?
Really not a dividing figure between just size on acreage. So you can apply this to any size pond.
You said a while ago you talked about some of these fish in a small pond and a large pond. What's a smaller pond? What's a large pond?
If I did that, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to differentiate that. All these tactics are applied to regardless of the size of your pond.
You're talking about the crappie.
Crappie.
Oh, I'm sorry. Crappie, applying crappie, anything under 20 acres, 25 acres, you might potentially see some problems.
You're talking large ponds over 25.
Yes, sir. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to pick it up. Sorry. Trophy bass. If you're targeting for trophy bass, you want to over harvest your bass. Make sure there's more forage available for those bass. If you're looking for a trophy bluegill pond, you're going to under harvest those bass. Essentially, you're going to make them overcrowded. So then you will see the result. Bluegill sizes get larger. Pond balance. Something you should take into consideration every few years, and the pond balance is checking to make sure that there's an adequate number of bass to keep those numbers of bluegill in check. Contacting your local wildlife and freshwater fisheries agency, they can contract out at no charge to do that for you. Fertilization, talking about stimulating the growth of the phytoplankton, so that's going to be the basis of the food chain in your pond. When to fertilize, looking at when the water temperature reaches over 60 degrees. Constructing you what we call a SETI disc is going to be able to measure that phytoplankton bloom. So ideally you want it in that 18 to 24 inches of visibility. And it's going to turn your pond in that kind of that pea green color. So when you fertilize your pond, you're going to stimulate that phytoplankton growth. It's going to be the basis of the food chain that's going to trickle all the way up. It's also going to help limit sunlight from getting down to the bottom where you may have vegetation from growing. And then also it's going to be the main source of oxygen in your pond as well too. And then closing out, looking at aquatic vegetation. How many people have got weeds in their pond? Weeds can be good and bad depending on what your management goals are. And I'm not going to go through all these, but you can see the benefits and the cons. And you can look at how you can adjust your management strategy. So when it comes to aquatic plant management, first thing to do is get that weed identified because that's going to determine what steps you take to rectify the situation. Your county extension office can do that, Auburn University can do that, your local freshwater fisheries office can do that as well too. Other things to consider, pond uses. What am I using at pond? Am I using this as an irrigation pond as well too? If it's an irrigation pond, it may limit what type of management strategies you have, like putting herbicides in the pond, or if you can put herbicides into it, there may be a limited time before you, or a time you have to wait before you can use or turn on the irrigation pumps again. Other ways to do this is sending in a picture. Just put these two pictures as an example, not providing enough clarity. So when I ask folks to send me a picture of a weed to identify, we want it close up. Walking up to the bank and taking a picture like this right here is not going to give enough clarity and detail. So I actually want to see it in your hand or even with some type of a quarter or something to provide a size comparison as well too. And those obviously can be texted or emailed in. And a lot of times we can get those identified without having to come out to your pond. And then looking at management of weeds can be broken down into mechanical, biological control, and chemical control. And they're telling me my time is up. But I just want to hit on one thing with grass carp. It's not a cure or a fix for anything. But it is a good idea to potentially have a few grass carp, 3 or 4 per acre in your pond to help manage as a preventative. But getting that weed identified if you have a problem, and we can help develop a management strategy for it.
How long will those grass carp live?
Grass carp can live 20 plus years with enough food. Now, in ponds, usually about 6 or 7 years, they've kind of fulfilled their purpose. So when they get really, really large, they're kind of like us. When they're young, they're eating all the time. High metabolism, they can eat 100% of their body weight a day when they're young. But as they get older, they get lazy and just want to hang out around your feeder. So typically, every 7 or so years, you probably want to look to replace your grass carp.
Yes, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.